Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for another session of our Restart, Rethink, Rebuild webinar program. My name is Charles Renner. I'm the leader of the P3 group for the Husch Blackwell law firm. And for those of you that have been able to join us over these last few months, you know that what we've been trying to do is focus on the reality of the economic and health moment that we're in and get a perspective on the outlook related to the P3 sector on a going forward basis. Sometimes that has gotten us into infrastructure discussions or municipal and state level. And then one of the big topics of conversation for us really does revolve around higher ed. A lot of the challenges and demands that the higher ed sector has been facing pre-COVID, the existence of addressing those needs during this highly uncertain time, and that outlook going forward. So we're very happy to have some true leaders in this space for a discussion today. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. And if you have any questions during the webcast, please submit them via the question box. We'll try to answer questions during the webcast today. Our intention is to be in a position at the end of our speaker's time to go ahead and go through those questions. And if for some reason we do not get to your question or a fuller answer is needed, then we can take the time to get that answer out to you via email later as well. PDF of the presentation is available in the resources folder. And for those of you requiring credit hours, this program has been approved for legal education hours. And to report your hours, just click on the CEU icon at the bottom of your screen. A certificate of audience attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. And toward the end of the program, please be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your needs and questions. And that's very true. I cannot tell you enough how much all of the topics and speakers that we work to gather for these discussions is focused on those survey responses. That's all the housekeeping items for today, so we can go ahead and get started with our program. And after I go through a little bit of context, we're going to get a chance to hear from Maria O'Callaghan-Cassidy, the Senior Director of Operations for the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, and a true industry leader in the question of facilities, operations, and the key overlap that the higher ed sector is seeing on education delivery. The demands of partnering the public sector and the private sector to meet all of those needs is something that Maria spends a fair amount of time working and managing. And then we're also going to hear from an advisor industry leader, Igor Dabik with Deloitte. And he leads the public-private partnerships financial advisory team for Deloitte, and is going to be able to provide a deep perspective, particularly on the discussion we're having today as well. And then again, and I cannot stress enough how exciting this panel is, because we're just surrounded by leaders on the on this overlap. Jake Terzo with Johnson Controls, and leads the energy performance contracting and P3 division for Johnson Controls in the Northern Plains and the Mountain States. And if you think of the demands and the needs that higher ed is seeing on facilities, on operations, and in that intersect in a long-term service provision, you would want to hear from any one of our three panelists. And so getting a chance to get the perspective of all of them today is something we're very excited about. Little context for the moment. Our firm spends a fair amount of time evaluating the trends in the alternative delivery sector, as well as what the industry itself is seeing. And we kind of look at it from this perspective. There's an old quote I like: if you know where you are and which way you're tending, you'll know what to do and how to do it. And so we try to spend a fair amount of time getting a gauge on that. This is a reflection of right before COVID, where the industry perspective was. we were seeing an increase, modest annual increase in alternative project delivery. And a lot of that was pushed by innovation in the way these projects are getting financed. And you will see there the largest increase in share really is in the tax-exempt financing structure. And that was a driver going into the COVID moment. Going forward, we also see that the purpose of these project delivery discussions were most focused on energy infrastructure and what we would call social infrastructure, which is really buildings. And those are the two particular overlaps that touch on the higher ed sector. Your buildings and most universities having some type of dedicated power needs. And so as much as that was something that was becoming an increased delivery option going into COVID, we're certainly seeing more of that now. And we're currently beginning the evaluation of the trends outlook going forward. And I can tell you that one of the things we've noticed is a significant increase in pre-launch project considerations that fit in our alternative delivery model. Almost a doubling of pre-launch projects from just a couple of years ago. And this is all during this moment, which I tend to look at as a moment where the needs that are there have been there before the crisis hit. And this is a highly beneficial time for planning and beginning to focus on how to get those projects delivered. And we're certainly seeing that. Some of the reflections that we've seen, which has been a constant, is not only the reasons for seeking alternative delivery in demands like this, but also what some of those inhibitors are. Financing options continues to be a large driver, as well as risk transfer and the benefits of industry innovation. And probably that last point, the industry innovation, is one that will continue to drive this discussion. And it's innovation driven by need. And the need is driven by the increased demands that the higher ed sector is seeing, both in their facilities, the types of skills development, and just the sheer volume of different responsibilities that the university leaderships are seeing. And that's why I think most exciting for us is our first speaker, Maria O'Callaghan Cassidy, who is a leader not just with the University of Pennsylvania, but also in group discussions with her peers on the needs for facilities, demands, and management. So with that, I wanted to begin by having Maria give us a perspective from the university standpoint. Maria?
Thank you. Thanks for that nice introduction. So it's been quite a journey over the last several months. Just trying to figure out what next year's budget is going to look like and what we're going to be focusing on. Having to pivot last March when we shut operations down was a huge challenge, because most universities, most larger education facilities are huge ships and they don't tend to turn very easily. It takes some time. But the pandemic required all of us to make some really harsh choices immediately. I think that the Wharton School, luckily, because we've always had a focus on our infrastructure, fared a lot better than most. And that's because there is this refocus on mechanical systems and infrastructure and making sure that you had the investments there. Topics that were typically not very welcome with the financial folks in administration, because A, they're not sexy, B, you can't really touch them and understand exactly how they're going to benefit the organization. And so I saw this across the board with organizations that just didn't have the ability to have the number of air exchanges that were required to bring students back into the classroom. So what I do like, though, is that facilities management, and this is from all of my peers and also folks across the country and even in Europe, are saying that those that are in operations and facilities are now starting to have a more prominent seat at the table, at least for now, and we need to hold on to that so that we ensure that the right investments are being made to maintain our facilities. So one of our biggest challenges is that we were in the process of doing two major construction projects. One was a developer build It was only the second one in the university's history, and it was for our entrepreneurial group in partnership with the School of Engineering. And so it has a maker lab, it's got an electrical lab, it's got a VR cave, it's got a test kitchen, it's got space for students to collaborate. And then there are small businesses, student ideas for businesses where they can have pods so that they can develop their concepts with oversight by staff and faculty at the university. As a developer build project, this is very not normal. To say it's not normal typically at the university, because as with most universities, they try to build these 100-year buildings. And what you're seeing is this shift in that idea that, is this really going to be around for 100 years, or is this a concept that will probably change significantly over time, and what we need is for now and the next 5 years or 7 years of planning. And so you're starting to see other campuses look at partnerships with developers to build facilities that, let's say, don't have all of the finishes, the finish levels that a lot of higher education facilities have become accustomed to. Because the reality is that what students need is a functional space. Faculty need a functional space that is both flexible and quickly usable, right? So that was interesting. And the other building was a building that we built above a parking lot above a substation, which was a culmination of 6 years of planning. And of course, during the COVID crisis, trying to figure out how you're going to meet your end date with rolling COVID shutdowns through teams of workers, and then long lead items. You know, we redefine long lead items when you have entire plants that shut down. To that end, both projects opened only a month past due, only 30 days past due. And they're highly successful, and we're just waiting for the full population of students and faculty to start utilizing these spaces. Coupled with that, we had to make some tough choices, like I had said, and what are they? You know, I think I share this experience with a lot of folks, is that immediate shutdown of leases, not knowing when staff were going to return, and, you know, cutting leases, absorbing people back, but they're not physically back in the spaces that are on campus. And then trying to devise a plan. We had just finished our 5th 20-year space outlook, and that had to be shelved because clearly our world has changed. And so trying to look into that crystal ball and figure out what we're going to do with space, what is it going to look like? And here are some of the challenges. What workers do need to be on site 5 days a week or full time? Because higher education has always been very skeptical of people working from home. But what this pandemic has proven is that there's certain roles that absolutely can be successful working remotely, and sometimes even more successful because they don't have the distractions of being in the office. So doing a division by division analysis of who can work remotely, who needs to actually be there full time to interact with the students, and what does that space look like? Is it large hoteling space? Is it individual offices, which I don't think we're going to go back to? And then also looking at the beloved faculty offices and what do we do with that space? I'm not saying that that's going to come about anytime soon, but they are for the first time being looked at. I mean, these are spaces that are 180 to 250 square feet for one person. And when you're looking at space and what the needs of space are going to be moving forward, for example, what type of teaching facility is going to be needed moving forward. Faculty offices have to be part of that discussion. And then shared resources across the campus, where a lot of times higher education lives in silos, where individual schools and centers have their own viewpoint on how spaces should be used. And it's kind of like, don't put peanut butter in my chocolate, and I didn't put chocolate in your peanut butter. And now they're being forced to create spaces that can be shared uniformly across the campus. And I know University of Penn is definitely looking at that from the provost level, and my counterparts across the industry are definitely looking at that as well. And then again, the classroom design. What does it look like? I think that hybrid and online learning is with us forever. I mean, I say to my son, you will never have another snow day. In fact, he's online today as we're getting an ice storm, taking his classes. So what does that mean? Is it studio space? Do we have a high-tech studio developed? And how many of them do you need? And what does this do for the student experience? And who decides how many students could participate in it, and what the corporate partnerships might be able to be in those studio spaces? So again, I think that this pandemic has created a lot of opportunity for us. Nobody has the crystal ball to see where we're going to be. But I think that it's going to have consistent change, not just in the next couple of years, but over a decade of change, I think is going to hit higher education, as they're going to have to be highly flexible to meet the changing needs and demands of the society, which is changing right now. We have a whole group of students that are coming in to the college experience that have spent the last 2 years online learning. So their perspective of how they learn and how they interact with folks is going to be very different than previous. And also resources are going to be extremely limited. So it'll be interesting to see what comes next.
Thanks, Maria. Igor, and I'm thinking of one of the comments Maria has touched on, which is really the shared space, the long-term needs that are serving multiple purposes and facilities. And you look at the way we've titled this, it's really advanced development in higher education. And that's certainly an advanced operations priority. And so as the higher ed sector is looking at different ways to deliver projects like that, and the role for potential private partners, as an advisor, what's your perspective? What are you seeing in the higher ed space, and what are the types of key markers that you place a priority on as you go through those discussions?
Thank you, Charles. So just to give a quick background on me, I serve as a financial advisor on a lot of these P3 projects, and mostly to universities and granting authorities, but occasionally to bidders as well. So we have this roundabout kind of 360-degree view of the challenge at hand. We typically get involved very early into the exploration stages to assist with feasibility studies, planning, funding, financing issues, and then we help clients through procurement and transaction advisory all the way through financial close. So the majority of time in this industry, I spend talking to either university leadership on one end, or investors and lenders on the other, or developers and builders, I guess, on that third end of the triangle. So what has driven a lot of this interest? My team covers infrastructure as an asset class in the United States. And of all the subclasses like transportation, water, energy, et cetera, the highest level of interest right now is by universities, and what they're seeking to do is understand whether monetizing their facilities and industrial assets makes sense. Around the country, as Maria mentioned, universities are sort of facing this precipice of change. And it may be surprising to some of you, but it may not be surprising to others, but there are over 5,000 universities and higher ed institutions in the US, and they're facing a variety of challenges that are applied differently to them because of different scale, because of different footprint, because of different budgets, but they're facing intense challenges. Some of those Maria mentioned. There's a rapid growth and simplification of this virtual connectivity that we're doing. I mean, right now we're not in person. I unfortunately can't come and shake your hand and chat with you after this, but it is real and it is working. There's also the changing character of what a leading university is. There are very actual or potential risks of declining enrollment or drastic changes to enrollment and matriculation patterns. There are also growing operational costs and capital investment requirements on this base of assets, whether they're facilities or industrial assets that universities own. When you couple that with the aging of those assets and the level of institutional debt that some of these universities have, that's already a bit of a tinderbox. That's all been exacerbated by the effects of COVID-19. So a lot of our conversations, especially when they start with various industry participants or universities themselves, are around, how can we use this opportunity that's requiring leadership of us to obtain a potential benefit for the school? And whether that's using a monetization or a P3 structure to transition and overcome the current crisis, or transition into the next stage of university life and kind of grow their market share in terms of both students and research and prestige, those are the questions that keep being asked. And a lot of this discussion is centered around core and non-core assets, especially the ones with me as a financial advisor. So the core assets, if you think about them, are your teaching, research, maybe even sports assets that bring in revenue. Your non-core assets are your operating base of industrial assets or real estate. Now, what the thoughts are, and there's I would say sort of a universe of thoughts, but the broad buckets of ideas are around, how can P3s help us achieve financial objectives, first and foremost? How can P3s transition us to a more efficient and resilient base of assets and asset operations? And that has a lot to do with how do you drive performance? How do you calibrate the right KPIs? And then how do you engage a counterparty, whether that's an innovative group within the university or a private counterpart usually, to implement those KPIs. But there are more than just financial operational objectives on mind. A lot of conversation is being had around how do you enhance your community and stakeholder value that you derive from the university? How do you maximize that local town, the local employers? How do you tie it all together? And finally, a lot of universities have made, and I think for the right reasons, sustainability goals and carbon emission targets. And the question is, how do you maximize these when you're also trying to solve financial issues? So I think at a high level, the way these P3s have shaken out is, the university tends to partner with a private company through a concession agreement, sometimes called a public-private partnership agreement. It's for a long term. It's generally been around 30 to 50 years. In this process, the university would relinquish the kind of the operating and the capital expenditure responsibility, but not the asset ownership. And it would relinquish it under certain terms within that time period of the tenor. And in return, the university would get some sort of combination of potential savings over the life of those assets, efficiencies, and upfront cash. Now, there have been a couple of, I'd say there have been about half a dozen projects closed in this sector, especially on the energy side. And a few of the seminal deals that you may have heard of would be the Ohio State University and University of Iowa P3s, where both of these universities received $1 billion of upfront payments in cash in return for selecting a partner who will operate their assets. And a lot of these funds will be used not just to make the facilities operations more efficient, but to actually shore up the university's operation, their budget, and their endowments, and potentially arbitrage long-term on some of the returns that they can make through their endowments versus the returns that they will lose on if they solely invest their capex into facilities. On the other side, investors are thinking about this from a different perspective. Rates are at an all-time low. In the U.S., abroad, it's even lower or negative interest rates. And so they're thinking, where can I park my capital long-term to serve as kind of a long-term inflation hedge? And I need it to be secured by a strong credit rating. Universities typically tend to have strong credit rating. And I need it to be stable. And I don't need it to be the next Facebook. I don't need it to make a ton of money. All I need is a long-term predictable stream of cash flows for several decades. And usually the investors who ultimately underwrite a lot of these deals are your pension funds, your insurance houses, investors that have incredibly long-term horizons and have to match assets and liabilities. And there's an additional benefit after COVID where there are some upfront tax loss optimizations that may happen that we've seen improve the investors' returns significantly, because you are letting them essentially use the asset base for a long enough period of time where they can claim tax benefits even if they don't own the assets. So I'll pause there and we can talk about any of these issues in more detail in the Q&A. But I just really wanted to frame out what the discussion has been, where it has touched on, and sort of what have been the pilot deals that have sparked this conversation. We were actually involved in the Ohio State deal as a tax advisor, so we were fairly close to this discussion of where is this tax value and where is this monetizable with private parties. Thank you, Charles.
Thanks, Igor. And that's great. And Jake, as I'm listening to Maria and Igor talk and kind of reflect back on the some of that industry survey information we had from what is almost a year ago now, and largely the lowest responses tended to be tied to the operations and maintenance side. And it's a little bit ironic because, a P3, the lasting impact is that collaboration, that relationship, and the needs that are being met on the operations and maintenance side. And I'd be hard pressed to identify a bigger leader and private sector actor than Johnson Controls as far as dealing with all of that. You listen to Maria talk about the driving demands, and Igor with respect to where these conversations are going. It really gets down to the importance of having the right partner in place on the long-term side. You guys have done a lot either in P3 or just as a service provider with this sector. And so I'd like to get your perspective on what you see coming with respect to this delivery model, and then how you are approaching these, really what I'd say is increased demands and complexities to put universities in a position to compete.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Charles. A couple of things I would respond to there. Maria's comment about the changing mindset regarding how universities build buildings. Are we building them for 100 years? Do we need to build them for 100 years? That's a very topical question, and I hear that a lot. Our group hears it quite a bit. We're in North America. We're the largest facilities maintenance consortium partner. And so we've got a lot of experience there, and we've got a lot of challenges going forward, because if we're building buildings differently, we need to operate them differently. We need to plan the life cycle investments a little differently. And I think that it all boils down in my conversations with a lot of universities with cost of attendance. Take a new student housing project, for example. We've all seen some very grand, some very beautiful collegiate Gothic style student housing halls, but they ultimately need to be subsidized because they don't, in many cases, support themselves with their own revenue. So for instance, in a project I'm working on right now, or have been working on in the last year or so, we're rethinking that whole concept, and we're planning for, a 45, 50-year life for the assets. So we're designing accordingly. We're planning our operations and maintenance accordingly, our life cycle reinvestments accordingly, and ultimately, positioning the asset and positioning the rates to have a beneficial impact on cost of attendance. As the other panelists have mentioned, the pandemic is causing a shift to online. What we're hearing from our partners is that a certain percentage of that is going to be very sticky, that it's going to be around for a long time. We're adjusting the on-campus enrollment numbers a little bit in some of our projects based on that to be conservative. I think that some of these things are playing out real time. I think that the pandemic is accelerating some of those, as Igor and Maria mentioned, and it's forcing us to ask and answer those questions in real time. The student housing project that I mentioned, it was put on pause last March, like many of the projects that we've all been involved in. And I got a front row seat to those deliberations. how do we need to change the design of our buildings? How is this going to affect enrollment? What will be the future of the traditional on-campus student experience? So, all those questions needed to be asked and answered over the course of the last year. Fortunately, we have ways of getting answers to a lot of those questions, and have been very active in doing so. We just got back the results of a market study where we were trying to refine our housing rates and product mix, and surveyed thousands of students, had a number of meetings with student leaders, design workshops, all that sort of good stuff. And generally, what we found is that students missed the density, missed the community that was in the first year experience. There doesn't seem to be a problem going back to double occupied suite style units, for example, which was one of our concern, because it would naturally have a significant impact on design and cost. So I think the feedback that we've gotten recently is pretty optimistic, but there's definitely a reduction in bed count that we're planning for to be responsible. And also the design criteria are shifting a little bit to make these more affordable buildings, which ultimately have a positive impact on cost of attendance. I can pause right there if we have any questions or like to move on, Charles.
Okay, that's great. I've actually got a few questions to kind of float around with each of you, and I might this one I'd like each of you to respond to. Maybe start with Maria, and then Igor and Jake in that order. But Maria, so you've kind of introduced the perspective of the sheer demands and responsibilities you're looking at, and those complexities, and not every project is the same. Are there particular project types or demands that you think, from the university perspective, lend themselves to increase private partnering more than others? Are there particular partnership opportunities that you see as more likely from your perspective?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's primarily on the technology side. I mean, the classroom environment has definitely changed. We're always going to have this hybrid now. And a lot of smaller schools, maybe ones that don't have enough funding, are definitely going to need that interaction with their students. And they're going to have to build classrooms that they can have both an online experience, a hybrid experience, and an in-person experience. And it kind of harkens back to, I would say, gosh, I'm dating myself, like 15 years ago when Cisco came out with their great conferencing equipment, where you could basically talk to the other side of the United States and have this great interaction via a conference system. And they came and partnered with a lot of the business schools to set it up in at least one classroom. And I think we're going to need stuff like that moving forward. And then there's also the aging infrastructure. There's a lot of deferred maintenance across many campuses and different schools based on, the money that they could raise and how much they could actually put back into their facilities. And that's not going to change. You're going to need to show, especially in these older buildings with deferred maintenance, that you have the ability for fresh air exchanges, that you have enough electricity to handle all the technological needs that are going to come about. So there's a lot of room for partnership there. And also just with the university in general, because they're going to have to redefine space and space usage, because resources will be limited. They will be limited for the foreseeable future. I can't express enough how much these 2 years of remote has really dug into schools' reserves.
Igor, just picking up of Maria's response there, I mean, I kind of think that by sheer numbers, we were seeing more volumes on like student housing partnerships, and yet the infrastructure demands have been sitting there for a while. between her perspective on technology and infrastructure needs, does that line up with what you're seeing with the various clients you're talking with? Do you have thoughts on where these highly likely partnership opportunities are?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Maria hit the nail on the head when she mentioned deferred maintenance. That seems to be a challenge across the board, and that backlog is very difficult to solve, especially if your credit capacity, your borrowing capacity is pinched, or your resources are stretched thin. I think from a mechanical standpoint, as a financial advisor, I put everything in a spreadsheet and think about it in positives and negatives. But from a mechanical standpoint, we're looking at a need to fix a deferred maintenance and asset in operating and capital inefficiency issue, while at the same time seeking to address, aspirational commercial objectives, community objectives, sustainability objectives, and those come into clash quite often. So where public-private partnerships really have a potential to address these issues over a long-term horizon is they have the ability to structure the interactions, the trade-offs between the private sector and the universities in such a way where the energy transition and the greenification and the sustainability targets are all interwoven into a payment formula that seeks to incentivize various actions of improving while disincentivizing actions that are not desired, like increasing costs or increasing capex requirements. So it makes it a little bit easier when you bookend a 30 or 50-year time period as a developer and operator to optimize your costs over that period, unlike it would be for a university that is sort of making capital investment plans on a 5-10 and then trying to see where the road leads them and trying to adapt, right? COVID really was the wrench that was thrown in that wheel, and a lot of universities, I believe, the Wharton School is doing quite well at handling some of these challenges, but a lot of schools are not.
Jake, give you a chance to respond to that, and maybe as you do that, Maria had mentioned technology and infrastructure and where those partnership opportunities are. I mean, if you could, as you respond, touch on just the role of technology in infrastructure projects, that may help give a little perspective on what a partnering opportunity can bring to that side of things.
Sure, and I'd like to kind of build on what Maria and Igor were talking about regarding deferred maintenance and how that's driving some of these projects. I'll give you an example. A project we just delivered last summer. It was a steam plant project, but we drew the boundaries of that project a little bit more broadly than traditionally would be done. So instead of just the steam plant asset, the primary asset, we did about $35 million worth of work on distribution system, steam, heating, and HVAC systems in the buildings throughout the campus. So we drew the boundary of that public-private partnership a little bit more broadly, and we calculated energy and operational savings associated with those distributed improvements to help support the pro forma of the primary project. And of course, we can step in and accept some of the risk, put guarantees and handback conditions in place where we're covering not just that steam plant asset, but also the other equipment and systems that we touch throughout campus. So it's a little bit different way of approaching the deferred maintenance problem.
And we've got another question, and Igor, this may be one to have you touch on, and so I'd say it's kind of a two-parter. I mean, one part of what Jake is outlining is the long-term economic benefits. Really kind of what we'd say the life cycle costs as opposed to those short-term development project costs. That's always been one of the challenges in the public partner space, is evaluating the long-term economic benefits, particularly if you're not appropriately accounting for the cost of deferred maintenance, right? So from an advisor standpoint, what approaches are you seeing that are most effective to help the university side factor that in to their evaluative process? And then, the second part of that is to do it right. Procurement always takes some time. And so what, in that context, what procurement approaches are you seeing that are helping with the I guess you'd say the efficiency of the procurement?
Yeah, I like that question. I think that's a prescient question that's being asked a lot. And in our mind, as sort of observers of the challenge, this makes sense in two stages, right? At first, you sort of evaluate, make the business case, and then what you decide during that stage, then you go out and run a process to solicit, procure, and transact. But it's not usually as simple as, make a business case and see if people agree with it and move on into procurement. Generally, we found that universities that have success are differentiated than ones whose transactions drag on, in that the successful universities secure a mandate really early up front. And when I say a mandate, what I mean is they secure internal buy-in from these conflicting sides that I described earlier, from these conflicting stakeholders within the university that I described earlier. So that mandate is not just sort of positive, what do the sustainability people, the finance people, the operations people, the community, what do they want? But it's also, what are they not willing to give away, right? Defining those red lines. Because what you do when you go into a P3 procurement is you essentially invite complexity. You say to the market, hey, I've got these assets. Please give me the most creative, wild ideas that I've never thought of or that I didn't think could be done, and tell me how to solve it. So naturally, the responses you get are going to be attempting to economize one set of incentives over the other. So one set of interest, maybe financial, maybe sustainability, over the other. So by nature, by definition, they will dig into your negotiating position and try to cannibalize portions of it for the benefit of the rest. So going into this with a clear mindset of what is acceptable and what isn't to the key stakeholders makes the process of procurement a lot easier and simpler. What tends to happen with unsuccessful procurements is at various points, as the private sector gives ideas, various stakeholders get, find themselves and their red lines crossed and hold up the process. And the moment you hold up a process, what that signals to the private sector is that, okay, this project is deprioritized. Let us focus our limited resources and time on another project. And once you get deprioritized from that level of industry focus that you've had, it's really hard to earn it back. And it leads to suboptimal outcomes. So I think this procurement process is not just a matter of procuring an idea, but it's really obtaining a mandate, stress testing different ideas, and figuring out what your specific set of stakeholders are willing to accept on your specific set of assets.
Thanks. And Maria, maybe picking off of that just a little bit, the decision-making process in the higher ed space, you really have to take into account a lot of different stakeholders. And I'm kind of thinking of your comment earlier about the objective of reaching shared space needs. So, when you are working to identify the right project delivery and project needs where you've got shared space amongst schools, professions, expertise, and needing to translate that into a facilities-driven procurement, how efficient are you seeing that process, and are you seeing are you identifying ways to impact that in a way that assists on the time on the procurement?
That's a great question. And I wanted to say that Igor is absolutely right. I loved a couple of his comments so far. One is about bookending the conversation and making sure that you're including everything sandwiched in there. I think the biggest challenges with universities and higher ed institutions is that, and I hope this doesn't come across the wrong ways, a lot of them don't look at themselves as a business. And so when you have all these stakeholders, they kind of, whoever is the squeakiest wheel or whatever is in favor at that particular time, that's where the system kind of bends to. And we're faced with a significant challenge now where we have to kind of move forward as one unit. So when you have significant sustainability goals, and that's one unit driving that forward, and then you have acquisition services at the university that are both taking into account acquisitions and sustainability process, and they're going in another direction. And real estate is going in their own direction. It's really hard to get it all together, especially with utilities and coming up with standards for the university when certain schools might not have the funding available to meet those standards. So you absolutely have to, now's the time where we have to get buy-in across the board. And I will tell you that I know this is hard to believe, but communication is very difficult in large organizations. And to get that consensus is very difficult. And there's a lot of folks just don't have the patience for it, but it has to be now because we're making decisions with funding that we might not see for a very long time to come. So we have to force ourselves to make the right decision and kind of have leadership that will make sure that we're not bending to pet projects or to whims, that we're actually looking at what's best for the overall university and not leaving it up to individual schools and centers or specific projects. And that is something that is a shift from what has typically been the culture across the board. I'm not just talking about University of Penn, I'm talking about my counterparts across the United States. It's just a cultural it's a cultural thing with higher ed that is going to have to change moving forward. That said, it's refreshing to see that there's starting to be this discussion, and back to your question, of folks coming together and saying, what can we do to create shared resources? We haven't gotten anything substantial yet, but at least the conversations are occurring. They're being documented, which is key. And the right people are being invited to the table. And that's the other thing. A lot of times decisions are made without the folks that have the intel and the day-to-day operational experience to manage these processes in place. So things are being omitted, things are being, certain groups, again, the squeaker wheel is getting more of the funding. So again, it's about making sure that there's a long-term plan, the right people are at the table, and the communication is consistent. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think that we're reinventing the wheel here in some sense with how universities are going to move forward, because it's also a very scary proposition for some folks, especially with you have long-term employees. Universities tend to have very long-term employees. Some of them are union environments, and they're extremely skeptical of third parties coming in and offering solutions, right? That could mean job changes or job losses or significant changes to what their job is going to be on a day-to-day basis. So there's a lot of factors that go into play, but there's definitely room and a need for someone to help organizations see the whole picture and come up with a total plan and help them guide them through that process. Because most people that are in administration at the universities don't have individual school and center experience, right? So they're kind of in central administration, or they've moved up from schools and centers, and they don't have day-to-day interaction with the individual schools and centers. So it's important to have someone, again, bookend how all the issues and make sure that they're all being addressed with one plan, because it's really hard to backtrack. In fact, it never happens once something is kind of initiated.
Thanks, Maria. And Jake, you know, we can't predict everything, but between Mother Nature and the great state of Texas, timing allowed us to have this pre-panel sidebar about energy and sustainability versus efficiency and the like. And we happen to be working on two higher ed energy P3s at the moment, and I think that all the factors matter, but I think one university went in with a clear priority towards sustainability, and the other one has focused on efficiency with respect to deferred maintenance and cost issues. And I think the clarity of those has helped the private sector respond appropriately. I mean, all those priorities matter, but just understanding where the emphasis is. So maybe on the balance between sustainability and cost efficiency in the energy space, how important is it for you all to understand where that emphasis is on the customer side, and what types of approaches kind of guide you once you know that? It's all in the context of having a clear scope from your partner on the procurement matters, but if you could address that a little bit.
No, great question, and it's incredibly important because it'll in many cases change how we structure the deal from the ground up. And I'm thinking of two recent examples. One where there was a sustainability goal. A campus wanted to be 100% net solar, but they also didn't want to use their credit to do that, and they didn't want to come up with any money up front. So that drove. I mean, in that case, it was kind of both priorities. Hey, I don't have a deferred maintenance need, but I don't want to impact my balance sheet, and I need to accomplish these sustainability goals. So that direction helped us from the very beginning to structure that project in the right way, and we didn't have to change midstream. Another project I'm thinking of where it was a clear deferred maintenance mandate. Hey, any sustainability boxes we can check along the way, we'd like to do, and we'd like to take credit for. So on that one, again, we structured the deal a little bit differently. In that case, we were providing an integrated proposal where we were the constructor, the developer, and FM provider. So it gave us the flexibility to change the deal in a way that met the university's priorities.
Thanks, Jake. Igor, you had mentioned Ohio State, and we've had some perspective from Maria, and even the examples I was thinking from an energy standpoint, that there are different categories of financial strength or endowment size and capacity in the higher ed sector. And that from my view has pre-COVID has certainly had an influence on not as much the long-term planning and aims from the university side, but at some level just the ability to do a couple things at once, tackle that deferred maintenance, look towards placemaking, and stay competitive going forward. As you look at the types of projects that are being discussed now, addressing deferred maintenance, identifying the sustainable new space needs, when you're discussing project priorities like that with higher ed providers, how big of an influence is the size and capacity of that university client and the types of approach you're taking with them, most specifically to the financing? Is there a different risk perspective that you're looking at there? Are they requiring, the less in the endowment, the greater the financial return risk analysis is being pushed over to the private partner, that type of approach?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question, Charles, because most of the conversations that, start with people in the university space that I don't know personally, start out as follows. Hey, Igor, Ohio State got $1 billion of cash in their endowment up front. Can we do that too? And you know, while it's an attractive number, Ohio State has, as a campus and as a base of assets, had a very unique set of circumstances that enabled them to monetize those assets in such a large upfront cash payment. And then the return profile of that transaction sought to satisfy different types of capital requirements on the public side over a 50-year horizon. So what you're looking at is quite a generous return split into three categories. So the Ohio State payment formula, the payment mechanism, essentially provided for a fixed payment for a portion of the assets, for a target payment around the variability and achieving certain objectives, and for a CapEx recovery. And I think that ties into the initial point I made around investors seeking to place long-term capital to work. You know, there's this paradox in power systems development, and it's around, you know, do I get paid on the incremental kilowatt hour I squeeze out of my machine? Or do I get paid on the incremental percentage improvement that I lower carbon output? And those two come into conflict head on. And the way that can be solved, and the way it has been solved at Ohio, was a fairly elegant way where that incremental kilowatt hour of energy and or pollutant was capped in order to, and a return was promised on the incremental dollar of capital improvement. Therefore, what they did is they transferred the technology selection risk to the private sector, right? So if in 20 years, there's a better power generation technology than the current set of technologies that are being used at OSU, the concessionaire has the incentive to invest more money and greenify and recycle those assets because they know they're getting a fixed return on their capital investments. And it's a delicate balance, but I think that's the key and the kind of creativity that can be achieved through public-private partnerships.
Thanks, Igor. And we've got time for one more question, and I wanted to shift that over to Maria. Maria, this is kind of a follow-up on what we've just been talking about, but one of the things that I've noticed is that the larger, more high-profile institutions, one of the things that comes with that is I'd say an increased sense of responsibility or a greater objective in becoming a stronger community partner, and so that can add to the partnering responsibilities and the investment needs and the planning roles that you shoulder. So I'm just wondering, from you and the peer institutions that you spend some time engaging with, how big of an influence is that community partnering becoming from a facilities planning standpoint, just to give a little perspective of the sheer number of priorities that the public side partners of these transactions are looking at?
I think there's going to be a greater focus on the community partnerships, especially as you see higher education partner with developers to build buildings within communities. So outreach, providing internet access, providing access to community members, building schools, things like that are becoming very, very important. Today, Penn does an amazing amount of outreach to the community. But having access to buildings, having access to programs within the university, especially in urban areas, there's going to be a significant push for that moving forward once we get out of the pandemic. We're seeing sister schools, schools that even in the Midwest that are planning for community outreach programs, whether it's online classes, and giving them access to online classes, and also providing resources that are open to community, not just to the students and those within the university, faculty, staff, students. So it's yet to be fully realized yet what that outlook's going to be, but there is a huge focus. And we have to admit, you're going to have a lot of universities and higher education facilities. They're going to shut down. They're going to merge. The money's just not there. You're going to see them merging. You're going to see certain institutions closing down. So there is going to be this massive shift within higher education in the United States within the next decade. And some of those things are going to be realized within the next 3 to 5 years. And when that happens, universities tend to be the primary or one of the largest employers within a certain area. And so there is going to be a lot of discussion about what higher education's responsibility is to the communities in which they serve and where they're located. Again, I don't have a magic bullet to tell you exactly what that's going to be, but it's something that's part of every discussion with planning now, where I would say that 10 years ago, it was kind of, okay, now that we've got our plan, how are we going to involve the community? Now it's, right on the front page, it's what we're talking about, even as we start the development of new projects.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks to everyone. As we look and see the sheer increase in pre-launch P3 projects, I think it's very helpful to have a sense of what are the priorities that the public and private higher ed institutions are looking to tackle. How are they evaluating those projects and is getting assistance with being guided into them? And then, what are the purposes, talents, and considerations that the private partners that will be with those universities for a long term are looking at? And I couldn't think of three better individuals and institutions to help us have that conversation. So I want to say thank you to all three of you. Thanks for everyone for joining us. And I hope everybody stays warm and enjoys what I think is now becoming an opportunity for us to start thinking a little longer term as we can see ourselves evolving out of this moment. So thank you very much. Everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.